hearing is called to order. This is the public hearing of the City Council Legislative Oversight Committee. The purpose of this public hearing is to hear testimony on Bill number 170467 and Resolution 180355. I am Councilman Kenyatta Johnson. I am the chairperson for the Legislative Oversight Committee. I recognize the presence of a quorum of committee members, including Councilwoman Maria Keone Sanchez, Councilwoman Blondo Reynolds Brown, and Councilman Alan Dom. Just a note on procedure for those who are joining us, we will hear testimony on Bill number 170467 before moving to a public meeting to consider action on that bill. Following that, we'll be moving back to our public hearing for testimony on Resolution 180355. Can the clerk please read the title of the bills?
467, an ordinance amending Title II of the Philadelphia Code entitled City County Consolidation by amending the Chief Assessment Officer's authorization to set standards for the valuation of properties for taxation purposes, all under certain terms and conditions.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are here to talk about property assessments today, a topic that is technical and complex, but has very real, serious consequences for all Philadelphians. Assessments determine our tax bills, so they help us determine our household budgets. They help us determine if our household budgets are in red or in the black. And they help us determine whether everyone is paying their fair share for city services. Many Philadelphians, including me, have a bad case of deja vu. When AVI sent property assessments across the city through Sky Roof, my council colleagues and I never said never again. All Philadelphians deserve a transparent property assessment system that is accurate and fair. That's why we doubled down OPA's budget and passed new mandates based on industry best practices. But we're right back in the same mess. Property assessments have spiked suddenly without warning. In Point Breeze, where I currently live, and I'm raising my family, and I've lived all my life, the average residential assessment increased by almost 50% over the last tax year. In some cases, values on nearly identical properties on the same block have moved in opposite directions. The response from the public has been predictably harsh. My office has gotten a steady stream of calls about assessment problems, and the value of tax appeals have jumped from a few thousand to nearly 21,000 this tax year. Bills are due in a few weeks, but thousands of appeals are still pending. The result, public confidence in the accuracy and fairness of property assessments is very low. This crisis of confidence is made worse because OPA is ignoring its transparency obligations. After ABI, Council required publication of OPA's assessment methodology and standards, along with assessment numbers and analysis for each year. I think I was the actual individual who introduced that resolution and or bill requiring OPA to provide that information. To date, none of that information has been made public. 2 outside audits were recently released, one commissioned by City Council and one conducted by the City Controller's Office. Today, we'll take a look at the key findings in those reports and engage the administration on the path forward. We can all agree that reform is needed, but we're here to drill down on the details and make sure the jobs get done swiftly and properly. And I also just want to add, as an elected official who's consistently working on this issue, addressing the issue of gentrification in Point Breeze and Graduate Hospital and Grays Ferry, this is one of the #1 issues that constituents are calling my office asking for explanations and also some level of reprieve. I'm a strong advocate for development without displacement, but also I want my constituents to believe that the work that we're doing here in City Council to help people stay inside their homes and not be pushed out is based upon us doing our due diligence and holding those accountable, including all of us who represent our constituents, to the best of our ability with fair and accurate information. And so we want to make sure that we're not balancing the budget here in the city of Philadelphia on the backs of people who have been long-term residents. And so that's my personal perspective in addressing this issue, and I want to turn it over to any of my colleagues who have a few remarks. Councilwoman Maria Kenyatta Sanchez.
Thank you, Chairperson, for your leadership and your continual advocacy on behalf of long-term residents around development. I want to thank the administration. The bill that is before you is a bill that I had introduced in 2017. It's one in April of 17. It was a bill that was originally scheduled in June, as was your resolution. It was delayed for personal reasons. And then we are here today. I want to add that I think rather than play, the blame game, it's where do we go from here? One of the things that this bill, when I introduced, proposed was that we be more transparent in disclosing the formula by which we come up with certain valuations of property. And as wonky as this area of tax assessments may be, it should be spelled out so anybody can understand real basic about how do we assess land, how do we assess structures, and what if any number is factored into properties, particularly in areas, changing neighborhoods, as you mentioned, Point Breeze and my neighborhood of Norris Square. Mm-hmm. It has been my contention that I think that the abatement value, and what I will continuously call during this hearing and as we move forward, unrealized value, because until you're paying taxes on the property, it's unrealized value, and how we factor the unrealized value of people's homes based on their sales price, and what that does to the calculation of the rest of the properties on that block or in the general market areas that we use as part of our assessment process. So I want to thank the administration again for working with us on this. I will allow our OPA director to put his testimony on the record. I will ask a series of questions for the record. I want to thank again the administration for clarifying where our understanding was last year versus where we are today. I will try to keep my questions simple so that folks are very clear about the simplicity by which we should be factoring and assessing properties in the city of Philadelphia. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Will the clerk please call the first witness?
Michael Piper.
Good afternoon, Chairman Johnson and members of council. My name is Michael Piper. I'm the City of Philadelphia's Chief Assessment Officer, and I thank you for the opportunity to provide this testimony on Bill number 170467, sponsored by Councilwoman Sanchez. OPA's top priority is to maintain an assessment process that is fair and that deserves the confidence of all taxpayers. OPA is absolutely open to discussions with Councilwoman Sanchez and the rest of City Council to address the assessment process in ways that it can be approved so that all Philadelphia taxpayers may benefit.
Thank you, Councilman Maria Kenyatta Sanchez.
Okay. So just to clarify and put some stuff on the record again, thanks again for all your help and willingness to be open throughout this process. So I'm going to ask for some simple questions about how and if ever we factor abated properties into the assessment process.
So the question about how or if abated properties, and by abated, I guess we can call that also new construction or substantially renovated, the properties that would be eligible for abatement, how they're factored into the assessment of non-abated or non-new constructed properties. And the simple answer is they're not factored in to our process at all. The primary factor that we look at for new construction or abated properties is the condition, and we code the properties using a condition code. So for instance, new construction, substantial renovation, we would code that at 2. A property that's not new and is 50, 60, 75 years old on the same block, we would code that as either average, meaning a 4, or below average, meaning a 5. If we have those two properties on the same block, there's a locational similarity, but because the conditions are so dissimilar, we do not use the abated property factor to assess the non-abated property.
So when you come up with your general market area, how, in determining the general market area and the general market average, what number do you use to calculate it?
When we look at the geographic market area, which is sort of our scientific definition of neighborhood, we're looking at how it is that the market treats or responds to sale prices of similar properties within that neighborhood, within those boundaries. Those boundaries are can be slightly fluid from one year to another, because if we see, for instance, there's a block in which folks are paying a certain amount of money for single detached properties, but that value is, that price is something that's closely related to a neighboring GMA, then we may change the GMA of the property. And it's just really another part of how we code that particular property, the GMA, the condition, where it's situated on the block, the age of the property. When we're looking at all the things that we factor in, which is including the GMA, when we get to, again, the condition, we stop when we're comparing otherwise comparable properties to say, no, this property is new or substantially renovated. These properties over here have been there for 40 or 50 years. We cannot make the comparison from the new ones to the existing ones. That's where the comparison has to stop. It can be in the same GMA, but it can't be compared for valuation purposes as if it were new.
How do you back end that then? So if we have 100 properties on a block and 20 are tax abated, you're coming up with an average of a GMA based on sales, right? Not the unrealized. How do you back end that in?
So within that GMA, we're looking for comparable sales. For residential properties, that's...
Well, so let me go back to that. So the sales piece is part of the issue, because that begins to set the market. If most of the properties that are sale are the new ones, right? Versus...
Not necessarily, no. We're looking at sales. We are looking at sales. We're looking at the new sales, but we're looking at the sales of existing parcels also.
So how do you back end the abatement value on the sales?
How do we put the new construction, how do we determine what's abated? Well, for new construction, it's a little bit simpler to put a value on a property because we have additional information. We have sale prices if there are more than one property that has sold. We also have, typically, we have building permit information, and we are experienced enough to know how to extract the soft costs away from that to make a determination
so
how much.
Is there a formula that everyone follows, or is it different?
For new construction?
Yes.
New construction, the market value, if we use the cost approach, the market value would equal the land assessment. I'll put it like this: the land assessment, which would stay taxable, will be the market value minus the building value. And if we're looking for the building value, which determines what's abated, we look at the total value minus the land value.
So where are we now percentage-wise, land versus structure? I mean, those of us who looked at other cities like Boston and others where there's more value given to land versus structure, because I think all of us can agree we've disincentivized renovations because people say that's why we're going through this process. The debate started 8 years ago, because if I got an extension or a new kitchen and I took out permits, then I got reassessed, right? And therefore, people looked at it as a penalty. And because so much of our assessment value is structure versus land, how do we fall in there now that all the land has gotten done, percentage-wise versus land versus structure?
Yeah, and we saw the same thing after the first year of AVI. We have two things when it comes to land that we want to make. This is part of what we're going to put on the website to be very clear about how it is that we assess land. You have vacant land, which is valued the same way we would improve parcels. We look at comparable sales of vacant land because that's what that vacant land we predict it would sell for. And then we have the land portion of the assessment on an improved parcel, which is the contributory value of that land to the parcel. It's not what we're saying the land would sell for separately because the market doesn't, no one's buying the land from underneath. If you own a property, they can't buy your land. They can, but they're not typically buying your land separate. So to answer your question where we are in terms of a percentage, what we did was we tried to get a more detailed, more nuanced picture of what it is that the contributory value of the land is depending on the neighborhood, the age and condition of the structure, where the structure is situated.
So why do we put structure in the calculation of land?
Because let's just take two extreme examples for purposes of explanation. You have a property that's sold for, let's just say $20,000, and then you have another one that's sold for $200,000. The one that's sold for $20,000, let's just say, being on the same block as the $200,000 one, what you typically would see if it's sold for that cheap, if it weren't vacant land, if there were an improvement on it, it was an improvement that was about to be demolished because it was in that bad of a shape. In fact, if anything, it was a liability and cost money to demolish that. So that's why somebody only paid. So if you looked at the two contributory pieces, you could understand that the most of the value was what? For the land. That's what somebody paid for. But if there were new construction on that block, most people are paying for the new constructed improvement. So more of the value would be on the improvement in that instance.
So we're never going to get to a place where once we have CAMA up and going, that there's more consistency on land value, irregardless of whether there's a structure or not. I mean, I think part of the challenge to what people consider the moving parts of, again, assessment, when so much of our assessment value is contingent on the structure versus the land. It's expensive to live in Rittenhouse, right? There's a value. It's less expensive to live in Norris Square and less expensive to live in Hunting Park. So you mean to tell me at no point will that be more apparent?
It will be more apparent and more consistent, but it won't necessarily be applied in a way that you're going to look across the city and say all the improved structures have a land to building ratio of 20 to 80, because to us, I mean, that's the easy thing to do. We wouldn't be having this conversation if we did that, but that's not the, we don't consider that to be the consistent way to do it. The way we've been doing it, and you know, our values have been upheld on appeal, is that we're looking at every factor that we can legally take into consideration when we assess the contributory value of the land.
Okay. So I'll ask a couple more questions, and again, the bill before us today is about ensuring that the administration put forth the formulaic value of how they assess and to ensure that, again, the unrealized value of abatements are not factored into it, which the administration is committed through this process that we're going through. But going back to the GMAs, one of the concerns about the GMAs is you have 650 of them throughout the district. Are there standards around these general market areas that are written and documented that if I read and say, okay, this GMA makes sense, this GMA makes sense, do we have a standard, or these are just 650 that have been there forever and we haven't changed them?
So because the GMA is a part of our process that factors into the way we do modeling, particularly on residential properties, if you don't mind, I'd like to I'd like to bring up OPA's Director of Mass Appraisal, who can explain how it is that we use the GMA and how they're created and how we change them from time to time. Kevin Keene.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Your name for the record.
I'm Kevin Keene, Director of Mass Appraisal and Analysis.
So the director was saying you were going to explain to us the modeling that allows us to get to the GMAs.
GMAs predated modeling. We created the GMA layer originally back in, I think, 1999. It was a replacement for a way of loosely defining neighborhoods, and the question in forming a GMA was that the general guidelines are, if you have two properties that are the same, and you expect them to sell for pretty close to the same amount of money. The moment you take a property and crosses a street and the value changes, that's a different neighborhood. And that's kind of the way that we defined it. All properties in the GMA do not have to be similar. You have, just like you can walk down a block and there's all different ages, sizes, property types. Within the GMA, you get the same mix. The underlying principle is that any two properties that are the same should sell for pretty close to the same amount of money. That's the test. There are some other tests. The GMA has to have enough properties in it that
what's enough?
Within a 3-year period, you get enough sales activity out of a GMA. Would say at least 10 sales.
When you say enough sales, does that mean it's a neighborhood in transition or just traditional market sales? Because you're saying enough sales. What does that mean?
You have to have some sales activity within a GMA, although it's possible you could have some GMAs where they're very, very stable and you don't see very many transactions. But our guideline's always been you need to have at least 200 properties in a GMA so that in a 3-year period you could expect to see 6 to 10 sales. Now, in times when the market is slow, you may see fewer sales than that. In times when the market's hot, you may see more sales than that. But if there aren't at least that number of properties in a GMA, it's not going to be able to tell you anything because there won't be enough activity.
So let's go to that. So you're saying a 3-year period. We promised people we're going to do annual assessments. Not the point here, but 6 to 10 sales. What do you do with those sales numbers? Well, how does that change the GMA?
When we see the GMAs are reviewed as typically as part of the valuation cycle. So there's a time point, there's a point every year where the GMAs are reviewed, and what we look at is how prices are changing within the GMA. Are they going up, down, remaining stable? We define, if we have areas that are close, GMAs are typically going to have the same distribution of property types. Like we wouldn't consider a GMA where half of it's non-residential and half of it's, or a neighborhood where half of it's residential and half of it is non-residential and vacant land and other uses, the same as a neighborhood where 90% of it is residential use. So when we review GMAs, we look for where things are changing. And if that change is not because of new construction or because of anything other than change in the prices of average condition, typical properties, we generally won't change the GMA. But as you see where, like if you look like in Brewery Town or Fish Town, or there are places where the boundaries change over the years because certain blocks become more in line with one neighborhood than another where they've traditionally been, and you see neighborhoods improve or decline. So we will look at how prices are changing within neighborhoods or within specific blocks. We'll compare what's going on in a specific block with the rest of the neighborhood, and if it doesn't look like it fits, like if we're seeing sales at $80 a square foot in a neighborhood where what's typical is 40, well, that block, they need to be in a different neighborhood.
How does that get factored back? So this is what amplifies the notion of people getting pushed out, right? There's a new construction of unrealized value of properties. I live in a long-term property. I have 1.5 bathrooms, new construction all has 3.5. How does that value, and when you look at that, because you're looking at permits, which we haven't even talked about, because I think one of the things you factor is licenses, permits, right, for renovations, as well as the sales, right? Correct. Those are the factors that trigger reviews of the GMAs.
Well, there are a number of factors that would trigger a review of a property. And when we review enough properties, both sales and the way characteristics are changing, that gets rolled into the GMA review. The review of the GMA is usually one of the last steps before we go into valuation, because by that time we've looked at how things are changing in terms of the overall makeup of the properties and what's been selling. So after we've looked at both of those and done some analytics on that, then we'll look at whether or not the GMAs need to change. But in answer to your specific concern that prices for new or rehab properties are raising prices for other properties, in our process that really doesn't happen, because the new properties are considered differently. There's different adjustment coefficients for new properties than there are for average condition properties or below average condition properties, or large houses versus small houses. So what's true of the typical property may not be, that property is probably not getting the same adjustments as new housing, rehabilitated housing, larger houses.
So how do you back end that in the GMA so that the market value, if you're using permits, L&I permits, and you're using sales value, and you have, again, a block with 100 houses where 50 no improvements have been done, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe 30 some minor improvements, and then you have 20 new ones. How do you ensure that that long-term resident that still has 1.5 bathrooms, their value does not get skewed based on those other factors?
Councilwoman Sanchez, so I think there's kind of two parts to the question. How do we factor in the value of new construction, but also how does it affect the assessment on non-new construction? Mm-hmm. There's slightly two different sides to that. Again, we don't factor in the new construction when we look to assess the existing properties, but the question, does it affect the assessment? And it does, because what happens is, over time, the existence of new construction or substantially renovated properties, let's just say we can even be more granular on a particular block, is going to affect the demand and the sale prices for existing improved parcels on the same block. So when you see sales of 75-year-old properties starting to pick up because folks want to live in that neighborhood, and you mentioned Norris Square, but you know what happened in Norris Square, of course, didn't just affect the Norris Square, it affected the surrounding areas. You're going to also see that reflected in the sale prices of the existing property. The sale prices of the existing property are what we use when we look to model assessments for the existing properties, not the new construction, but the existing properties.
And that's what people will argue is unfair, right? Because again, I'm in a transitioning block, right? When I look, when my neighbors say to me, I haven't done an improvement in 20 years in my house value goes from 75 to 175 because 3 houses sold at 375. Mm-hmm. You know, I can't explain to them why their value has changed if nothing's changed and everything is the same.
Right, it's only the sales of similar properties to that particular neighbor, and believe me, we get that question all the time.
But again, it's sale because there's an outside marketing demand, mm-hmm. right? And someone sells their property because this person's going to buy this house at 125,
Right.
put 100 and sell it at 375. All of the market forces are impacting long-term residents, and we can't explain how we back end these values to them. Because they're saying, I don't want to sell, but I don't want to leave. And
Right.
if I'm sitting in a house that was 75 for the last 10 years and now it's 175, that's where you see the problem with long-term residents. I mean, that's the narrative we have not been able to explain to
I understand. The idea that the assessment is tied to the value or the sale prices, I think that's the way property assessment is supposed to work, but that is also the problem. That's the problem, because if you look at the other side of that, if there's a block in which there were a lot of tear downs, or if there was a fire on the block, and you still live on that block, and it doesn't look like anyone is buying those properties, as you can imagine, the value of your parcel diminishes also. So you may not be able to sell it this year as what you could have sold it for before the fire. So the principle of regression and progression, there's two sides to it. The unfortunate side is, as you said, when you don't want to sell your house, but the sale prices of houses like yours are affecting, as they should, the assessments.
Right, and I guess, again, this goes to the broader policy. During NTI, we spent $100 million. We demolished a lot of parcels, right? And we diminished value in a bunch of areas, right? And created the market forces. And then when you have blunt instruments like a 10-year tax abatement, that comes in, and then everything just goes. And then obviously the delay in our assessments has just exasperated what people feel. Like they feel the market moved too fast. And in fact is, we had a long period of devaluing, to your point, of
Right.
properties,
Right.
and then this other piece of it. And again, we've lost that narrative with folks. I mean, to me, it still should be simple enough. If I lived here, it's 20 years, my value really hasn't changed. How do we protect those people from the value changing from market forces of unrealized value and equity?
Yep. I understand the question, but as you said, I think it's more of a policy issue than it is an assessment issue right now.
Well, no, because we have to explain to them how in our formula we don't negatively impact them for making a decision to just stay in their house and not have improvements because they don't need it, because they're okay with the 1.5 bathrooms. They don't need the 3.5 bathrooms.
Right.
We say, how do we make things more equal in our formula?
I guess we need to have more discussion about how that formula should look in regards to us doing assessments versus maybe a deviation from, good assessment practice. But
Rob, and then we can just vote on the bill and get out.
How you doing, Mr. DeBoe?
Good.
Just state your name for the record, please.
Rob Dubo, Finance Director. I think to Mr. Piper's point, I think he's right that there are two separate questions here. One is an assessment question, which is getting the value accurate, and then one is a tax policy question, where if values do go up, and how do we protect homeowners? Right, and that's kind of why we've tried to put in place a variety of relief measures to kind of...
No, I get the relief measures, Rob. This is about how do we ensure, because we have lost confidence and faith in people that the formula that we're using is accurate. We set policy when we decide a formula does not back end all of those market factors that we've created through public policy, which is tax abatements and all. So the relief program is our way of saying we don't have the other stuff right, so we're going to fix it. So my thing is, as we move forward in fixing all of this, right, because we're now in this public discussion, how do we ensure people that the formula accurately reflects value and that we don't jeopardize and penalize people who do no improvements? And then to a certain degree, we penalize people for improvements because improvements then trigger new valuations, right? Like what's the formula that is fairer if we have all these blunt instruments?
So I think the formula the role of the formula is to get the value accurate, right? And then the policy question is, what do we do on the tax side if an accurate formula impacts people in ways we didn't want it to? And I think that's where the other measures come in. Because OPA's job is to make sure that they're getting the value accurate, that they're kind of understanding what the market will bear. And then the policy questions are, once you've figured that out, how do you make the tax system work?
Right. I know Councilwoman had to go. Are we going to be okay? Okay. So just quickly, so going back to these GMAs, because again, I think this is part of what will, over the next few months, as we talk about what's the formula look like and what are the policy implications of how we develop a formula that establishes a fair practice. So this narrative that exists, that we have incentivized certain unrealized values and then penalize long-term residents who don't have these amenities and the values in their system. Last question around GMAs. So GMA is done, as we talked a little bit around comparable sales. Explain to me the difference between, and I think Bob DeBell talks about this in his testimony, the issue of the market trending and the trimming that you do in these GMAs.
Could you restate that in terms, what do you mean by trimming in GMAs?
In your general market areas, you use comparable sales, same condition properties. We talked all about that, right? You're saying to me the abatement values is not a factor in this stuff. But we also talk about there are other factors that impact those assessments, right? And I think Rob's going to talk about a little bit about market trending and trimming. And trimming is you look at the sales, you look at all the stuff, and you decide we're going to remove the top and the bottom or something from the bottom. Who determines that factor? What's and why?
That's something that happens in the modeling process, and we don't trim at the GMA level. We usually look at an entire part of the city. And the way that the trimming works is that if a sale is exerting, there's a statistical test for whether or not a sale is exerting more influence on the model than it should. And
who makes that determination and based on what?
It's a statistical test. We just apply it in the modeling, as part of the modeling function.
And so what are the unintended consequences of that potential trimming in poorer neighborhoods where we've seen some of the overassessment?
Typically, it's not aimed at any particular subset.
It isn't, but it has unintended consequences, right? And what we're seeing is that there's an overassessment. So again, this goes back to policy around how do you protect poor working class neighborhoods when you want to apply a model across the board and you take certain, everybody knows whoever lives in 3-4 and 4-0 what the model is. How does that impact that? Well,
the way the trimming works is it actually looks at where the model is not able to predict well for a property because there's something in the data, there's something generic maybe in the neighborhood or that property type, or it's not being well represented. And those are the properties that will get, those are the observations that will get trimmed out, so that those observations that are leading to bad or inaccurate conclusions are not part of the process. That's what the trimming is about taking out observations that are misleading and that lead when you.
But who determines what's misleading?
So it happens in the modeling process. There is no specific. Typically, when you trim, what we'll hear about is people taking off the top and bottom 5 or 10%.
So who makes that decision? What top, what bottom, how many?
Well, that isn't the way that it's done. The way that we do it is we actually look at each case as to whether that case is producing undue influence on the model. And if it is, then it comes out. So there isn't.
So
when you're looking at undue influence of the model, what is? Give me an example of what that is.
Councilwoman, let me interrupt for a minute just to fill in a piece of answer. I think that Kevin is explaining, but just overlooking. When you said who determines it, the test itself is a test without us having to make any decisions on it that says if the number is this amount or higher or this amount or lower, it's statistically insignificant, or sometimes it has a degree of non-relevance, I would say, to what's affecting sale price predictions, okay? And those are the measurements.
So what deviation model do you use? I mean, if you're saying all things being equal, nothing is. All things being equal, this model is negative 50,000 or same part. I mean, that's what I'm trying to get at, because that's where where you see folks pinpointing saying this is a problem because of this, it's usually one or two properties that throw it out of whack. I just want to know, what are the factors that create those outliers? Is it improvements? Is it vacant land? I mean, like, what are the factors that say, okay, we're going to trim this?
I think what we could do, in fact, I know what we could do is actually show you what the test looks like. To answer the question, what factors, I mean, when they're trying to put together a model, which is in itself an iterative process, they're looking at a script and testing it out and looking at the predictability of the assessment based on sales that we've seen. They're conducting a statistical test that Kevin's group can show you what it looks like, but just to give you an example of how it's a little difficult to answer it is simply as what factors affect it. Sometimes you may have, let's just say, 6 different factors that they're looking at, and you may need to determine which 2 factors are independent of each other or both causing the same increase or decrease in value. And because they seem to be collinear, that's not good, because we need to know, we need to be able to put a coefficient on each one of those factors to be able to derive good models. So there's a way that they can measure the relevance or the lack of relevance for each one of those factors, or how strongly it's tied to predictability, or how weakly it's tied. But we can show it to you, but it's...
So again, I think this is what sets up the confusion around the formulas. I believe that whatever formula, we adopt says a lot about our policy as a city and what we put value to. What we put value to improvements, to folks who don't make improvement. And what I'm saying to you, as we move forward in these formulas, we should be as intentional as to protect folks who don't do improvements, who had modest means, as we value unrealized tax abatement and improvements, right? If you're saying these things are change values, right, then we have to back end the people who are set in prefects, right? They're not moving.
Right.
And I think policies, we set that policy because you guys set the formulas, right? And not saying we're going to value the fact that they are poor, fixed income people with no improvements, and factoring that in means that we give this group more than we give this group, right? In terms of all things being equal, which they're not.
Yeah, I do hear what you're saying, Councilman, and that's valid. Again, as much as you all hear those concerns, we hear those concerns to the point that we go out and speak at the various council meetings in the neighborhood. We come out all the time. We don't mind coming out, but we don't want to come out and have to follow a developer, because the developer is doing something that turns into a tax abatement, which some folks, of course, and they're right, they say, well, it's not benefiting me.
They look at it negatively. We have created a narrative in this city that over the next year we have to change, that infrastructure improvements and investment increases and displaces people. We have a problem. We created that. right? So how we fix this over the next year, we have to show people, because now the onus is on us, all of us, to say to folks, we have a balanced value on all of those factors that make up this city of neighborhoods, right? These 650 GMAs have all nuances, right? But what we value and without letting the market forces of unrealized value, right? This bubble, Councilman Dom is here, he could speak to more. I mean, when people in Kensington read articles about these lots going from 20,000 to 150,000 in 18 months, right? We're like, that's going to burst, right? But in the meantime, what are the consequences for everybody in that area? And what I'm saying, policy, which we're supposed to set, should factor in all of those things. So fixed income folks, again, who have living with the 1.5 bathrooms, are not subsidizing, because the people with abatements are not paying realized value, that value. And so we have to show that to people. I don't know how we get there, right? And part of what we're trying to do here is we need to figure out what that formula looks like, and we need to be able to explain it. And I shouldn't have to be an assessor to explain it. I mean, I know the jargon a little bit, I mean, you know, but I should be able to explain and say there is part of the formula that takes into account, you know, homes without massive improvements, and then there's not an artificial value incorporated, because, again, until people pay taxes on it, it's unrealized, right?
So one of the things that we strongly agree with in the Ryan report is that we need to do a better job of communicating how we do our assessments, and we need to get stuff up on our website that people can look at and understand how we do what we do, and we're committed to having that done within the next month.
But I'm doing a point of information.
Yeah, you're the chair.
But that was a requirement since 2011. And that was just 8 years ago. So how come the methodology hasn't been posted and we're still talking about it today? I'm just asking for transparency, you know, the whole, you know, let's all show our cards and see what's going on. Like, at what point we doubled the budget of OPA, right, because of AVI, and the methodology still isn't public information.
Right, and that's why we are committed to getting it up there. We agree with you, people should be able to see it and understand.
Okay.
Councilman Green has a couple of questions.
Councilman Derek Green.
I'm almost finished. Okay, just want to put this stuff in the record as we move forward. What is going to happen in the interim between now and over the next year? I mean, what is the plan? And I know you guys will get into the discussion about the audit and stuff. What are we doing now after this first assessment review to folks who still feel like, I mean, are we still going to, are we going to accept all the first appeals pieces? I mean, what are we going to do with folks who are uncomfortable with their numbers and the fact that we've publicly acknowledged we have some challenges with it? What is the plan?
Yes, there's still the appeal process, right? So we do look at all the appeals. We don't just accept all of them, because some of the appeals are not based on, some of the appeals don't have merit, right? And we're not going to grant appeals that have merit, because that would cause their own problems. But that is still an avenue that's available for people. We are, and we go into this in the next testimony, there are a number of recommendations on how to improve our processes, and we are committed to implementing them, and we'll go through those in detail in the next testimony, and the process that we're going to use for valuing properties over the next at least year.
Okay. All right. Councilman Green. I'm sorry.
Just 1 second, Councilman Green. The administration recently did a report or announced that y'all were going to be freezing certain assessments. Can you elaborate or give clarity?
Sure. So for tax year 2020, which is the reassessment cycle we are in now, right now, for next year, which is what we're working on, what the administration did is look at the recommendations that the city's administration's consultant forwarded to us, and we also took what was in the audit, the Ryan audit, seriously. There were no recommendations, but we looked at the results, the report, and one of the recommendations from the administration's consultant was that for the time being, we look to do semi-annual reassessments because there were other recommendations, and implementing those recommendations would be time and resource consuming, but at the same time, we're also in the process of a very resource and labor intensive effort on the city's part to incorporate the new CAMA system. And to try to do all of those things while we go through our normal reassessment process, we felt, and the consultant also recommended that that would be more than we could handle appropriately and do a good job.
I want to,
one
sure,
kind of clarification. We're not freezing assessments. We're using a different assessment process that's called trending. Do you want to walk through what that is, Mike?
I'm sorry, Councilman. I did hear you say freezing, and I know
that's what the report from the administration. That's what was published.
Yeah, that's right. What we're doing is we are employing what's called a market value update through trending, okay, in which we're looking at market forces and determining what type of trend at a zone area, not across the whole city, because we know it's affected different ways in different parts of the city in terms of residential and commercial parcels. But we're looking at a zone level trending reassessment for tax year 2020, which is the IAAO, the International Association of Assessing Officers, recommends that has a very short interim process fix, but not a long-term process fixed for, and it's not, certainly not a substitute for doing ongoing reassessments. So that's what we're doing, and like Mr. DeBoe said, we'll get into more of the process of how that trending looks, you know, in the next testimony.
Point of information, doesn't that exasperate trending in market forces? Again, we're letting market forces that could blow up at any time lead the number and where we're going. Isn't that more problematic?
Well, it's not problematic if, again, we're tasked with tying the assessments to the market, which is, I mean, I know that's a disagreement in terms of maybe how a different policy should be set, but currently, because that's what we're tasked with doing, is tying the assessments to the market, whether it increases or decreases. That's what it's meant to do temporarily. Yeah, that's state law. That's what we're, you know. In Pennsylvania, it's state law. In some states, it's not, but in Pennsylvania, it is.
Just before I turn it to Councilman Derek Green, have we well, two things. One, so going through this process, if you have residents who are overassessed, right, in this process, what's the recourse for them? And this is what constituents ask me. Do they get a credit? Do they get a refund? Or they just take the overassessment on the chin and keep it moving?
No, as a matter of fact, so the initial recourse is for the taxpayer to bring it to our attention through the first level review process.
Yes.
And what that does is, and we always, you know, say it's a relatively new process since AVI, but it's actually something that helps the city, because that's a way for a taxpayer to give us feedback. Our data's wrong, or my property was demolished, you still got a structure on it. Hopefully we won't see too many of those. But something that we believe is there isn't there, or vice versa. That's the opportunity for the taxpayer to say, I'm being overassessed and this is why. If they're not happy with that result, they can file with the Board of Revision of Taxes, and in fact, they can do both simultaneously. And if, of course, if they're not happy with that result, they can file with the Court of Common Pleas. And I think the other part of your question, I guess, implies that the taxpayer needs to figure out what to do once the decision is made that they are overassessed, and that is, I don't want to speak for the Revenue Department, but having dealt with this question a lot, I can tell you that Revenue is set up and has a unit that deals specifically with addressing refunds, meaning you can apply to have that overpayment refunded or have that overpayment applied to a future year's taxes.
And have we explored capping assessments similar to California? I think if your assessment rises a certain percentage, then it's capped across the board. And I know that idea came up a couple of times.
I think there's a state law issue with that uniformity issue. I don't think we're allowed to do that. But I'm going to turn around and look at our attorney to make sure that that's right. That is correct.
Okay. All right. So if we wanted to go that direction, we would have to lobby the Philadelphia delegation and the folks in Harrisburg to give the city of Philadelphia the ability to cap assessments. Is that correct? Cities of the first class?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Councilman Derek Green?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to walk through a couple of things. So my understanding is that if a constituent receives their assessment, they can do the first level review. And then upon doing the first level review, if they're not satisfied, they can then take it to the next level, which is going to BRT.
Correct.
Okay. Is there any internal process within OPA that if a constituent has a concern with how they have been treated or how things have been handled at OPA, they can report something in an anonymous fashion regarding that experience?
Is there a part of the process, I might have missed a little bit, that the taxpayer can?
If they have an issue, like say they have engaged with a representative from OPA regarding their assessment and they feel that the interaction with the representative from OPA has been a negative one.
The interaction with the representative of the
OPA.
Call me.
I'm sorry?
They can call me.
Okay, I'm glad you said that, because just yesterday, and I as an at-large councilperson go to a lot of events all around the city. Generally my day starts at 4:45 and often ends at around 11:30. So I was at one of my 3 events last evening, and after I spoke, a gentleman came up to me and said his property taxes, his property assessment was significantly high. He contacted Office of Property Assessment, and in his conversation with OPA, when he tried to go through the first level review process, he basically, as he stated to me, now I have to investigate this more, basically stated that he was threatened in appealing this, and if he did go through with appeal, that his assessment will be double or triple.
Well, let me say this, Councilman Green, and I understand the question and the concern. The 2 things. Number 1, a taxpayer being treated unprofessionally by an OPA representative, again, they should call me. Mm-hmm. But on the idea that filing an appeal could work against you, I mean, I don't know what the conversation entailed exactly. I'm just going by what you're saying, and I'm sure taxpayer related it to you based on their interpretation of the conversation. But the again, when we get first level review appeals that come into the office, many of those we have to take a look at, and from the outset, we have to deem them credible or not credible. And not credible simply means that a taxpayer, based on their own words, is not asserting that they're overassessed based on any knowledge. It's just that they can't afford to pay it, or they don't think they should have such a drastic increase, which are, even though valid issues, they're not assessment issues. So we deem those not credible. But sometimes taxpayers, and not often, I don't think often, but I think occasionally a taxpayer, I mean, I had a conversation with a taxpayer that came through the mayor's office yesterday, in which the taxpayer, he had an issue. It was a valid issue, and that was the drastic increase that he got in 1 year. But he had to admit his assessment was fine, and lots of times that's what happens. In fact, when a taxpayer says that, oftentimes what we look into, when we look at the assessment and find is that we're still on the low side. And sometimes an evaluator may have, and they should say it professionally, but may have said to the taxpayer, you know, you have 3 different outcomes. You can file this appeal and have the assessment reduced it can be increased or nothing could happen. And sometimes that information comes across sounding like a threat. And I again would recommend that taxpayer call me.
Well, I gave the constituent my card, and whenever there's an interaction between two people, both sides have their perspective on the conversation.
Right.
And I've been around some time, and I'm very cognizant of that. But this is not the first time that I've heard of concerns by taxpayers when they start to engage in the process, are provided information that some would say discourages them to take it to the next level. So it's not the first time I've heard that. And so once I get that constituent information, I will definitely follow up. One of the concerns, and I won't get into issues regarding CAM and other stuff, which I've stayed on the record for some time, but listening to the colloquy between people on the panel and Councilman Sanchez, it just brings back this whole issue of transparency. Part of the reason why we, from my perspective, outside of other reasons why we should have done ABI, that if you were trying to just calculate your real estate taxes, it was a very engaged process, using a politically correct term, in reference to common level ratios, and just very difficult to calculate what your tax rates were. So we've gone from that perspective to Active Value Initiative, which is much more transparent in reference to calculating your real estate taxes. However, we've gone from a perspective of giving people ability to understand what their real estate taxes are now in a much more transparent way, to now we can't really identify the methodology of how your properties are assessed. And so basically you have your assessment of your property and the real estate tax rate. So we've gone from a period of time when trying to calculate the taxes is very challenging. That's now been made more transparent. But when you try to identify the valuation of the property that also impact your real estate taxes, that's not transparent. And so as I was listening to the conversation with Councilman Sanchez, and this has been an ongoing issue in reference to why can't we give constituents a understanding of the methodology of how their properties are assessed. Now I understand City of Philadelphia is a large city. It's a complex city because we have a lot of different types of housing. If you look at housing that is in the 9th Council District or 10th Council District, tend to be a little more homogeneous because they were built in a certain time period. But if you go on the other side of Staten Avenue in the 8th Council District, you have homes like mine that were built in the 20s. And if you go to other parts of the city, you have a whole mix. So I understand the complexity of the housing stock that we have in the City of Philadelphia. But my question is, why can't we provide constituents with the methodology that still may be tweaked? There may be some variables involved, but the methodology of how their property is assessed.
So one of the things we had said in regards to what council put into law, we understood that, and that is we need to make our methodology and our process transparent and on the website so people can see. And in fact, the specific wording, I don't remember exactly what it was, but I know it referred to having something similar to what they have in DC, which looks wonderful, but DC has a camera system, and Philadelphia is just in the process of getting one. Having said that, and let me finish, we still understand that it's a requirement, and we recognize it, and we have fallen down on that part of the job. I will not sit here and say that we can't have it until the camera system has been fully implemented. I can say that OPA and the administration are working to have something up that will not only explain our basic methodology and processes, but even get into more detail about what we're doing for this coming tax year.
So you opened the door. I didn't want to bring up CAMA, which I seem like I bring up CAMA every spring. So since you and Mr. Dubois are here, when will we see the first phase of CAMA?
CAMA is still on the same schedule we talked about last spring. So it's scheduled to go live essentially a year from now.
Say it again?
Essentially a year from now is when it will go.
A year now. I just want to make sure that I have this for the record. When did we initially start looking at CAMA?
So this version of CAMA?
No. When did we as a city start initially looking at CAMA?
So I'm not sure when BRT first started looking at it. Remember back then, BRT looked at it as an independent entity, so the administration at that point didn't have anything to do with that camera process.
Yes, an independent entity, but we still work with them in reference to looking at the valuation of real estate within the city of Philadelphia, because the administration controls the revenue estimates under the Home Rule Charter. So there were still communications between BRT and yourself and parts of the previous administration. So you still have, I'm sure you had some sense of when they started looking at CAMA.
The initial, and Mike and Kevin may be better able to answer it, the initial BRT CAMA process was before the last administration. I think it may have been during the street administration, but I'm not sure.
Right, which when you were, was that when you were budget director?
It may have even been, I'm not sure, it may have been before. I don't know the timing of it.
Okay, so we can agree that it's been going on for a long period of time.
It has, but I would say we are now at a place where we have an outside vendor who has been working with us, I guess, for about a year now. And we have a schedule that we've talked about with you for well over a year that we are still on, and we still are on schedule to be ready next January.
I'm going to leave my CAMA questions for another time, but even though we don't have CAMA, and I heard you, Mr. Piper, say that's no excuse for not providing the methodology, which I think I heard, and you made reference to DC has CAMA, and that's one of the reasons why it's easier for them to provide the methodology. But even without CAMA, we're using a methodology every year for assessments. So is it my understanding that in a short period of time, very short, we'll be putting up on the city website the methodology that we use for property assessments? Is that my understanding?
Yes, that is correct.
And when you say short time period, are we talking 30, 60, 90 days during the budget season?
We plan to have it up within a month.
I'm sorry?
We plan to have it up within a month.
And that's going to be information on the website in plain English that any citizen within the city of Philadelphia can read and get a general understanding of how the assessment of their properties are done.
There really would be two versions, and you guys step in and correct me if I'm wrong. One will be kind of the plain English version that you're talking about, but there'll also be kind of a more detailed backup with kind of more formulas that someone who really wants to dig into it can look at and understand.
Okay. All right.
Fair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Just a request for the committee. If this is going to be going up the methodology within a month, can you provide committee members with a copy of the methodology prior to going live on the website?
We can, yes.
Can we set a date for February the 5th?
I think we need, as Mr. DeBose said, about a month. What we're doing is, again, a process in which we have to, I mean, you have OPA and OIT folks talking with folks in the administration who are better at interpreting what we do so that it's palatable for everyone. And once we get to that point, which I think is going to take about 30 days.
Point of information. You said you're going to need about a month to provide us the information, but then Mr. DeBose just said
30 days.
On the website within 30 days. So,
right. So before we put it on the website, we will provide counsel with it.
I think rather than just providing it to you, what we should do is sit down with you and walk you through it and make sure we're all comfortable with that it's understandable. So
basically what I'm hearing, at the same time you're going to put up on the website, then you're going to provide some information simultaneously.
We will get you the information before it goes up. We will do all this within the next month. We'll get to you within a few weeks, and then that'll give you time to review it and for us to have it up within a month. So
to continue my point of information, the chair asked for a date certain. I understand that February 5th is not available, but I would venture that if we're talking a month, Friday is February 1st. A month is, well, February is 28 days, so I'm assuming that you'll be able to get it to us, if not February 5th, by February 21st, 22nd?
I think that's reasonable.
Or time earlier?
We can get it to you by February 21st, and then we can start the conversation.
Okay, so less than a month and before it goes on the website?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'll remind you that the bill requires it immediately. But, so you guys are negotiating more time than my bill. I'm just putting it for the record.
I want to be supportive of my colleague, the purpose of why we're here for this bill. So can you provide that information immediately? I mean, honestly, to be up front, and you
It's
know,
about
we
the
laugh,
same time
we laugh,
period.
we laugh and we joke, but I mean, the law says through the charter that this should have been made public back in 2011. So kind of how I look at things, or how I'm judged, right, is based upon deliverables at the end of the day. That's how my constituents view me and my colleagues. And so, you know, as soon as possible, I think will probably be helpful to all of us. And that's not trying to put nobody on the spot. It's just that we got a job to do, the same way that you have a job to do, being the head of OPA and the administration as well. Because we want to be able to go back and inform our constituents when they ask us questions what the process is. And we want to be able to explain intelligently what's actually happening when it comes to assessments. All right, thank you very much. Ken, is anyone else here to testify on this particular bill? Please
Madeline
come
Chicumba.
forward. You don't have to, y'all just, I don't want to say dismiss, but you don't have to say. And just for clarification, so we have a whole hearing that's around just specifically the methodology and actual property assessments. But after this testimony, we're going to vote this bill out, go into a public meeting, and then come back to our actual public hearing. Please state your name for the record and begin your testimony.
My name is Madeline Chicumba. I represent the North of Washington Avenue Coalition. This is a much needed bill, although it's very late. I spoke to the City Council on OPA assessments several times, all during the time that we were fighting to have the LOOP program passed. I told you about the assessments then, in which they went up on my assessment 1,000%. It went from $30,000 to $360,000. That's when you came out with the LOOP bill. That was fine. Now you want to repeat something else that is not so fine, based on these faulty, and I mean very faulty, assessments. I don't know what his assessors were doing. I do know the man who's been in charge of it, what he was doing, and that was asleep at the job. He wasn't looking out at what people were doing. And so now, here we have a fiasco going of the same thing. Assessments going up sky high. What, based on what? I don't know. They said actual value initiative. I did a small sample, just a very small sample, in my neighborhood. And condos, man, when I looked at what they were paying, I couldn't believe it. People on abatements, not even paying actual value. They buy the thing for $469,000, and guess what their assessment was? And has been and continues to be $390,000, way below what they paid. Now all of a sudden they're going to jump up after the abatement ends. That's right, abatement ends. All of a sudden they're going to jump up to people's sky-high value. Why? So they can get a loop? That's what it sounds like to me. Because they were all under-assessed between 2015 to 2018. My suggestion, and I put this sincerely to you, and though you probably will ignore it anyway, I suggest, yeah, you implement this bill. You got it wrong right about that. But the taxes be frozen at the 2018 assessment until we clean up this mess. There ain't no time for another loop bill. It's time to clean up a mess generated by OPA. That's what I'm suggesting. Freeze it at the 2018, because you already initiated that it was no change until then. The biggest change came in 2019. And since we already know that's a big screw up, There's no use having it implemented and just freeze the taxes at 2018 level. That's my suggestion. But implement this bill and get rid of some people around here that don't need a job since they haven't been doing their job. And I'm tired of it. And I have a small sample, which I will share with the city council, of what I did in my own neighborhood, showing how condos have been getting away on their abatements with under-assessments, and me and other people who live in the neighborhood have been sitting on big-time assessments, and we don't get an abatement. And I'm going to speak to the loop bill now, but that loop bill is treacherous. It will allow people who are receiving abatements to participate in that program. And I'll be doggone if I'm going to see that happen. You mean you don't get abatement now? And then when your abatement is over, which many of them happened in 2008, because the abatement started in 1997. And then you want a loop bill that started in 2008. 10 years. 10 years, and the prices were low when they bought these properties. And now you want to come forward with a loop bill because OPA screwed up and jumped up on their taxes 1.5 times more than it should be? Hell no. You're going to rethink this. It's going to be rethought. And I'm going to be pushing for that. Okay? And don't tell me, oh, I don't know about that. I'm going to show you the information because I have it. My little old self went into the thing and didn't even have to go that far to find out about it. Right in my own neighborhood. And that's why I'm for this bill, want you to pass this bill, and at the same time, I don't want another loop bill until we get this mess cleaned up.
Thank you for your testimony. State your name for the record, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Teresa McCormick, and I live in the 2nd District, where our area is being impacted heavily in terms of gentrification and when the reassessments took place this year. I want to take you through the process of the, if you take the appeal to go through the assessment. On January the 22nd, I went down to the appeal. And when I went down, oh, well, let me back up, I'm sorry, a little bit. When I got my report, my assessment was jumped up 65%. When I took the appeal, which came out on January the 22nd, I went down. And when I went down and appealed, I noticed that they removed my loop. I no longer have loop. What we're finding that most in your district, councilmen, are losing loop due to OPA. When I went and appealed and questioned the panel and the city lawyers, what was your formula? No one could give me a formula. It's supposed to go by your millage, which was determined by city council at 9%, and then it was supposed to go by the assessment, and no one can give you how do you come up with what properties are assessed at what value. On my particular block, everyone was assessed a certain price. But then a block over, which I live on a 2-story block, the ones that's 3-story are assessed $50,000 less than mine. Then when I go the block in back of me, which is 2-story as well, theirs is assessed at 1/3 of what mine's is, and no one can give me any reason on how did you come up with a formula. I actually met with Michael Viper. He knew that I really went off that day. I was in rare form, and I wanted to know, and I still question, because I'm not hearing it today. What is the formula, and how are you coming up with these assessment values that each one of the gentrified areas are coming up with? My concerns here is that OPA needs to be looked at, reevaluated, investigated, looked at. How are they coming up with these numbers? Because they're not adding up at all. For us longtime residents, for those that live on one street to live on another street, and versus those that are new homeowners, we're getting hit harder than anyone else, and I'm not getting answers to what we are doing. Right now, we can't do it. We can't afford this. And I see this bill here, and it's not going far enough, because especially when they sat back and removed loop, I watched you guys work on it, voted on it, and it was supposed to help us. But they came and took it away from us. As of last year, we don't have loop, and you didn't even know that that took place. My concerns is with City Council, like last week on the 22nd, are you coming down when your area is being heard at appeals? No one is there. I'm there like almost every other week when I'm in town, and I don't see a City Council person down there at the assessment appeals to see what they're doing. Because if you came down there and see what was going on, you would have a fit. Also, in terms of the assessment, there are certain groups of the assessment employees that represent each section of the city. So when South Philadelphia was heard on January the 22nd, there was no one from that department there to ask questions. I should have, whoever works on my area, I should be able to sit down and talk to them and ask questions. And because I was one that wasn't hearing no explanations, I ended up talking to Michael. But still, Michael didn't give me what I wanted to hear. What is the formulas here? All I heard today is a lot of excuses and a lot of lying that was going on before you. That's what I heard today. That's what I heard. So what we want to see is that we want to stop what is going on here. As of last year's, which is 2019, that we're supposed to pay in March, we need to go back and look over what's going on, because we lost loop. And I can't get an explanation on what happened with that. And I didn't sign anything. I didn't agree to it at all. So, council, I'm asking you, before you sit back and decide to vote on something, I think you need to investigate what's going on at OPA. Because where's the money? Because we're not seeing it. We're getting hit harder and harder each year, and no explanations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is anyone else here to testify on this bill? Public comment? This concludes the public hearing on bill number 170467. We will now go into a public meeting to consider the action to be taken on this bill. The chair recognizes Councilman Allen Dow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wonder if I could call back Mr. Piper, Mr. DeBow. Thank you. I have a couple of questions I wanted to ask. Do we know in the past few years, 2014, 15, 16, 17, roughly how many appeals were filed during those years?
We do. Let me see if I have that information with me, so that's just not one more.
Doesn't have to be exact, but a ballpark.
So I think that the first year of ADI,
Right.
in terms of appeals to the BRT, it was about 20,000.
For BRT appeals, yes.
Right.
What year was that?
For 2014.
Okay.
Every year since then, it's probably been kind of between 4 and 9, right? This year was around 9. But each year it's been single-digit thousands.
Okay. And then the other question, I have a few more, is I should know this, but I don't. What is the process if I'm a homeowner, I want a first level appeal? Walk me through the process. Give me a time frame on when I get a response. What do I have to do? How does that work?
When we send the assessment notices out, which is typically about a week after we certify, so end of the first or second week of April, it has a notice date on it. Within 30 days of that notice, the taxpayer should file with OPA the first level review. There's actually a P.O. box where we instruct them to file it. The application is already filled in with the particulars about the subject property. And the only thing the taxpayer needs to do is assert on the form why it is they feel something is wrong. Either the assessment is wrong, it's not uniform, or there's some exemption they feel they're entitled to, but we have not applied.
And how long does it take for us to respond back to that first level appeal?
So that depends on two things. Number one, the number of appeals that we get, but also the credibility of the appeal itself. And typically we will look at whatever we get in within, right after that filing window is closed, and we will make a decision on the non-credible ones first, because those don't require much beyond the decision. The ones that we think have any degree of credibility may require an actual inspection. So to answer your question, for the first group, within a couple months, sometimes maybe 90 days, maybe another month after that, if we think there's some degree of credibility. If it has any credibility and we need an inspection, then we have to schedule that with the taxpayer.
So, I mean, I saw one property, I was on Wyoming, where it was a twin, where one was priced at $99,000, and I think the next door, the adjacent twin, was priced at $369,000. Obviously the same property, and obviously a mistake. Can we possibly get a system where we can have a much faster one-week turnaround? That's clearly an error that could be fixed immediately.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that we are also working on for this coming tax year. And what we're looking to do is actually to be able to get to those, the ones in which there's some credible reason to believe that we made a mistake or there's just a valuation issue or uniformity issue. We're going to look to have someone, not necessarily the account manager, look at the non-credible ones first so that the account managers can focus on the ones such as what you described.
Right. So let me just verify, I'm going to verify these facts I'm going to share because I think this is our overview of Philadelphia real estate. Mm-hmm. The inventory in the city currently, valuation, market value, is approximately $170 billion. We have 580,000 parcels. And in this current evaluation, about 130,000 roughly went down, and about 370,000 went up. Of those 370,000 that went up, 25,000 roughly raised their hand and asked for a first level appeal. We also found out in the city council audit that the values in the city are 93% of full market value. So we're not assessing it full, we're assessing it 93, which I'm totally fine with that because there'll be fluctuations in the market.
93% of the market value.
Yes, that's what our council audit showed.
Right.
And what you're saying now is that we are now down to 9,000 appeals, which is less than 3% of the total number of properties we raised. And I'm listening to this testimony today and I'm saying to myself, what's going on? I think what's really has angered the residents is that the assessment increases were so dramatic, like 10.5% to 11%, that in many ways it wasn't an assessment increase, it was a tax increase that we put through of 10.5% to 11%. I mean, thank God we didn't have another increase in the taxes, but that's really what occurred. We raised everyone's taxes on average 10.5% to 11%, and they are furious because the rate of inflation is 2.1%. So for the average homeowner, I just want you to understand what I think is going on. It's challenging to meet these tax bills, which have been raised 5 times to the rate of inflation. So, I mean, I think that's really, in my opinion, the root of the problem. I can't sit here and say, look, there are plenty of issues that have to be fixed with OPA that we know about, and I know you'll cooperate and fix them. There's plenty of things that have to get done right. We need the camera system. But I think the overriding problem that I see is that we basically dramatically raised assessments, and to be fair, we probably should have lowered the rate, but we didn't do that. And that's caused everyone to have to pay a lot more money in an inflationary market that was 1/5 of the increase they received. That to me is really what occurred in a nutshell. And we thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to give that overview.
No, thank you. I echo your sentiments because when I'm out and about, that's what I hear, and most importantly, we should move with the same level of urgency on this issue that we do on other issues as it relates to the city of Philadelphia. So thank you very much. This concludes the public hearing on bill number 170467. We will now go into a public meeting to consider the action to be taken on this bill. The chair recognizes Councilman Derek Green for a motion on the bills we just heard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that bill number 170467 be reported from this committee with a favorable recommendation and a request that the rules of council be suspended to permit first reading of this bill the next session of council.
It has been moved and properly seconded that this bill will be reported from the committee with a favorable recommendation and with a request that the rules of council be suspended to permit first reading of this bill at the next session of council. All those in favor of the motions will signify by saying aye. Opposed, the ayes have it, and the motion carries. This bill will be reported from the committee with a favorable recommendation with the request that the rules of council be suspended to permit first reading at the next session of council. That concludes the public meeting. We will now return to our public hearing on Resolution 180355. I will at this moment call up Mr. Piper and Mr. Rob DeBoe. You want to start off by giving your presentation?
That would be great, thanks.
You know what, let me do this for a second because the resolution and the bill are basically pretty much similar. So I'm going to ask for the clerk just to reread on Resolution 180355.
Resolution authorizing Council's Committee on Legislative Oversight to hold hearings examining the Office of Property Assessment's assessment system and the impact of increasing real estate taxes on Philadelphia households.
Can the clerk please identify those giving testimony?
Rob DeBoe, Mike Piper.
And there's a third person with us, yes. And that's Robert Glademans. He is our expert mass appraisal consultant. And the three of us are here to provide testimony and answer questions concerning Resolution 108355. OPA works to improve the quality of assessments each year. The code requires that OPA be independently audited every 3 years, and the administration welcomed feedback from J.F. Ryan and Associates on both the quality of the 2019 assessments and our assessment processes. We took the concerns raised in the report seriously. As a result, we asked OPA's outside consultant to make recommendations to improve our processes. That consultant, Robert Glademans, is affiliated with the International Association of Assessors. He has over 40 years of experience in the assessment field. He regularly consults with other major jurisdictions and has worked with OPA for over 10 years. We are committed to implementing his recommendations, which I'll discuss shortly. With regards to the Ryan report, we were disappointed it didn't provide specific recommendations on ways OPA could improve its assessment process or address the audit's findings. The report also failed to acknowledge the substantial progress OPA has made since 2012. Of the 24 recommendations from an IAA audit concluded in 2012, OPA has implemented 13, 9 are in progress, and primarily tied to the launch of the CAMA system next year. The remaining 2 are partially implemented. These changes have led to improvements in the accuracy of OPA's assessments. OPA's state equalization board ratio, which measures the accuracy of assessments, has gone from under 30% before AVI to over 98% now. As we discussed in the last hearing, the number of appeals to the BRT dropped from over 20,000 in the first year of AVI to about 9,000 this year, only about 2.5% of properties where assessments increased. The Ryan report used a methodology that we believe inevitably led to inaccurate conclusions about the quality of OPA assessments. The audit compares OPA assessments to more recent, not yet fully validated sales that will be used in future valuations after they have been vetted. The auditor himself stated that the sales he examined did not appear to be fully validated, and after removing what he thought to be clear outliers, he proceeded to analyze the inadequately screened sales anyway. Again, those concerns did not deter us from embracing the need for reform at OPA, which I know is the heart of why City Council commissioned the report. That's why we sought the perspective of Mr. Glademans, who provided recommendations on several key areas. He recommended adding staff to assist with modeling, as well as the development of a separate sales validation unit. He also advised that OPA should seek support from a consultant to procure and better maintain existing data for building grade and condition codes. Regarding transparency and accessibility, he recommended OPA should better document assessment methodologies, produce more frequent evaluative reports such as ratio studies, and share those materials on its website. Finally, in order to allow OPA sufficient time to implement those recommendations, Mr. Gladderman's advised that OPA should temporarily move from a mass assessment valuation to a trending valuation, which Mr. Piper explained in the last hearing. So for tax year 20, OPA conduct market trending valuation, appropriately trending existing tax year 2019 values by property type, condition, and geographic area in an effort to keep property values tied to the market in the short term while OPA implements the expert recommendations. Trending is less labor intensive because values are determined for a group of properties using fewer factors. OPA will resume annual mass assessment valuations when the above recommendations have been implemented and a CAMA system has been implemented. OPA is committed to adopting those recommendations and is currently developing an action plan and timeline to ensure these changes are implemented expeditiously. Mr. Gladderman is here today to discuss his recommendations in more detail. At the same time, we understand Council's concern for residents who may be struggling to keep up with their property taxes. We remain committed to working with Council to discuss tax policy changes to help alleviate concerns that arise as property values appreciate in the strong real estate market. Last year, Council and administration worked together to increase the homestead exemption from $30,000 to $40,000 to provide additional relief to homeowners in light of rising home values. The Department of Revenue administers a number of tax relief programs, such as the owner-occupied payment agreement, long-time owner-occupied program, and senior citizen tax freeze to provide assistance to residents. City also offers income tax-based real estate installment and deferral programs to assist homeowners who may need help paying their property taxes. In FY18, City provided $110 million in tax relief to more than 250,000 Philadelphians. Revenue will continue efforts to increase the percentage of eligible homeowners enrolled in tax relief programs. That concludes our testimony. We're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. I had a question regarding capping assessments, and I know under the last hearing on the bill we recently passed, you talked about how it's the state jurisdiction to determine if we have that ability or not. Would the administration support such an effort in partnership with the Philadelphia delegation to introduce legislation in Harrisburg that will cap assessments that rise over a particular value?
I think we'd like time to discuss that. I understand the question. I don't want to answer on the fly, but let me talk about that and we'll get back to you.
Okay, all right. I want to take a moment also to acknowledge Councilman Al Toppenberger, who's here today as well. In terms of data, can you give me an overview of the type of property characteristics that you use to collect for residential units, and also how you actually collect and keep that data?
Councilman Johnson, I'm also going to call up for this question our Director of Master Appraisal, Kevin Keene. He can answer that because he works with it on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. I believe your question was, what are the attributes or characteristics that we collect in a single-family residence?
Yes.
So the things that we look at are the location of the property, which is determined by, number one, the GMA that it's in, but also how busy a street it's on. So there's typically a downward adjustment for being on a busy street versus on a more quiet residential block. So we look at the location in terms of that. We look at the type of property because we don't want to compare a two-story row house to a three-story detached house to a one-story twin rancher. So the type of property is something that we look at. We look at the time period in which the property was built. We look at the size of the property, the size of the building, and we'll compare that to the typical or the median-sized building for that model. So if your typical building is an 1,100 square foot row house, if you're larger than that, you may get an upward adjustment. If you're smaller than that, you may get a downward adjustment. But it's all centered on your relationship to a typical building. We look at the lot size the same way. We look at define what's a typical lot. If you have a larger lot than what's typical, you may get an upward adjustment. If you have a smaller lot, you may get a downward adjustment. We look at the general time period in which a property was built. So we have, I think, 7 periods based on construction quality and what was typical for the way properties were built, going all the way back to the colonial period to what's been built within the last 10 years, so that something that was built, post World War II is not being compared to something that was built 2 years ago.
And this information is collected for all units that are inspected?
Yes.
And on average, how many units are inspected in person each year? Not drive-bys, in person. And also, under what circumstances do appraisers go out into the field to actually do that physical inspection?
That's not a question that I can answer in my capacity. I deal with the data, I work with the models. We know that people do inspect properties. I don't have the metrics on how many properties each evaluator inspects. I'm sure
Mr. Pipe,
we can get you that information.
That information, just so we can get an overview of, on average, the number of units that are actually physically inspected as compared to rather data from pulling permits or what we call drive-bys.
In terms of a number, and I've actually asked our Deputy Chief Assessment Officer, Mr. Arrows, to come up just to correct me if I'm wrong. In terms of a number, we don't have a number, obviously, exactly how many or even a roundabout number, but because Philadelphia is a city in which many of the neighborhoods include the primary residential parcels of row houses, in which you can stand down at the corner of the block and figure out what's going on in one and make a determination in terms of the age, the number of stories, and the condition of all of them. Typically, this is the way we do mass appraisal. I will answer the other part of your question in terms of when do we actually, what condition we come out and make an interior inspection, if that's what you're referring to. So we normally don't go inside anyone's house unless they invite us in, and typically that would happen on an appeal.
And I raised that. I remember doing AVI, doing a town hall in deep South Philadelphia, and a couple of the constituents would come up and talk about how no one's never entered their home to do a physical assessment, and they were kind of confused on how their property taxes triple. And again, that goes back to how it's so critically important to make sure that the information and how you go about doing assessments are published, but also provided to residents, at least, even though this is technical, but as long as it's made, in, I guess, in a simplistic form, and at the same time, who am I to say if a person can interpret, the data? But people need to know, how do you get to the actual assessment? Because at the end of the day, if they don't have that information, then they're going to go off of what they assume. And a lot of times it's basically, I know in areas that I represent that's highly gentrified, the question is always, how come these particular areas are assessed at a different value than other neighborhoods, right? And then you'll come up with a conclusion that this is also another way to gain revenue for the city. Now, if that's not the case, that's why that methodology is important to have out there in a transparent way, so you won't jump from A to B to a conclusion, which may not actually be the case. So I just wanted to put that out there just for information as we move forward in this process.
We agree with that, Councilman, and actually in terms of getting more and better data about the interior of residential parcels. I know for AVI, we did look to try to gather some data. We sent out, we put door hangers on folks' doors, and we did get some information back, and occasionally we got to see the inside of a property. I think the next time we do an assessment project that involves the entire process, I think we need to try to go about that in a way that we get folks to trust that we're coming to try to get information about your property and get it right and not just make guesses.
Thank you. On the methodology, in our council audit, it found that OPA models require a high level of expertise, and this is something that wasn't rebuttal by the administration's consultant, correct?
Extra what?
Well, we will let the consultant actually answer that.
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon.
Talking about the requirement of a high level of expertise for OPA models.
Yeah, my name is Robert Glaudevens. I'm a mass appraisal consultant. I have done work for the city for the past 10 years. Yes, it is true that the methodology used by OPA to develop their values does require a considerable degree of expertise. Unfortunately, OPA has that expertise. It's the same type of models, incidentally, that we use on the county I'm from in Arizona, Maricopa County, Arizona. So it's common, and it's being increasingly used because of its effectiveness and efficiency. But it's absolutely true that it does require specialized expertise in statistics and data analysis.
So this current department consists of 3 people, a manager and 2 modelers. Can you explain, Mr. Piper, in terms of their level of expertise and their background as relates to implementing the methodology for OPA?
So you've met and spoken to our Director of Mass Appraisal, right, who is responsible for developing the models each year, and the people that work with him, and there's more than just 2, but they are actually certified Pennsylvania evaluators with some background in statistics, both with college degrees. But in addition to that, we've consulted every year for at least the past 10 years with Mr. Glaudemans, who is pretty much the foremost expert on mass appraisal in terms of advanced statistical techniques.
Okay. And I know we have recommendations from City Council audit that we're comparing with, obviously, the audit from the administration. And Council audit found that OPA models are not commonly used in the industry or comparable jurisdictions. And so you cited Phoenix and Iceland as jurisdictions that use the same model that we use here in Philadelphia, but their housing stock is totally different from the city of Philadelphia. So how do you compare the model that we use versus the model that's being used in places such as Phoenix and Iceland? And is our model actually the most efficient model to use? Because those are 2 totally different jurisdictions, rather cities as well.
The techniques can be used in various jurisdictions. It doesn't require that it be a relatively newer jurisdiction like Phoenix, Arizona. There's 2 other benchmarks where I've worked. The city of Washington, D.C., which Mr. Ryan referred to, uses the exact same techniques as the city of Philadelphia. The city of Boston would be another example.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let's see, at the particular time, I'm going to ask for City Controller Rebecca Reinhardt to please come up and do her testimony on her audit for the Office of Property Assessment. Can you stick around though, Rob? And Mr. Piper and your team, can you guys stick around for a bit? We would like to compare notes.
Good afternoon, Councilman.
Good afternoon, welcome.
Members of the Legislative Oversight Committee. My name is Rebecca Reinhardt, Philadelphia City Controller. I am here today to testify on Resolution 180355. Concerned with the dramatic single-year property assessment increases in tax year 2019 and the mounting public frustration around the work of the Office of Property Assessment, the City Controller's Office analyzed the accuracy and fairness of Philadelphia's property assessments since tax year 2014. I will provide a brief summary of our findings now, but I am also submitting a full copy of our report as part of my testimony. As part of our analysis, we conducted separate ratio studies for the 14 geographic zones of the city set by OPA to determine two metrics: the coefficient of dispersion, COD, and price-related differential, PRD. The COD is a measure of uniformity, or whether like properties are assessed similarly relative to their sales price. The PRD is a measure of regressivity, or whether less expensive homes are over-assessed relative to more expensive homes. We found that neighborhoods with the lowest median income in the city are also the neighborhoods with the least accurate assessments. Assessments in these parts of the city, particularly north, west, and southwest Philadelphia, tend to be less uniform and more regressive. That means less expensive homes in these areas are over-assessed compared to more expensive homes. In essence, our most vulnerable homeowners are paying more than their fair share of property taxes. We strongly recommend that the OPA focus its time and resources on immediately improving its assessment shortcomings in the neighborhoods that it performs the worst, and stop using only the citywide ratio study to assess its own performance. And in the testimony, you can see graphically the chart that shows the COD and PRD, uniformity and regressivity by neighborhood. The neighborhoods are zones that have the darker colors. If you can see north, there's H, G, A, B, you can see those. So it's basically north, west, and southwest Philadelphia. Those are the ones where the assessments are the most broken. And then it's also shown by household income. In addition, we found that the Office of Property Assessment has gotten worse at land valuation since tax year 2017, when the OPA performed a citywide reassessment focused on land values. Rather than identifying the true value of land from location to location on a per square foot basis, it appears that OPA often applies a fixed percentage of total assessed value, typically 15% or 30% to determine land value. The use of a fixed percentage for land value seriously undercuts uniformity. For example, we looked at a single block in North Philadelphia where all of the properties have the same lot size. In tax year 2016, before the land reassessment, all of the properties had mostly the same land value per square foot. But after the reassessment in tax year 2017, however, the land value price per square foot for these properties varied wildly by as much as $22 per square foot for identical lots. Land value issues also impacted abated properties. Best practices say that land values should be similar on a per square foot basis on the same block, regardless of an abatement. However, we found that abated and non-abated properties on the same block had significantly different land values beginning in tax year 2017, and these differences have continued to grow year over year. In tax year 2019, abated properties were on average upcharged on their land by $23 per square foot, which equates to an additional $350 in taxes for the median abated property. We recommend that the OPA address non-uniformity in land valuation with urgency, including releasing its current process and models for land valuation, as well as maps of land values across different neighborhoods of the city. Lastly, we found that historically, the OPA's assessments have not met citywide uniformity or regressivity standards until tax year 2019. Moreover, our results diverged materially from the OPA's self-reported results for regressivity and uniformity. This suggests something problematic. While it appears that citywide assessments have become fairer and more accurate year over year, overall citywide, we can't state that definitively. Due to a lack of transparency, we have no way of knowing how the OPA selected data for the purposes of its own ratio study, how it went about calculating the COD or PRD, or why our results differ so significantly. In closing, I'd like to make one final point. Transparency in the OPA is a big problem. No one knows how the Office of Property Assessment arrives at its assessments. To the administration's credit, they have stated that they intend to increase the information provided to the public about the assessment methodology and process. I want to encourage the administration to commit to more than bare bones transparency. There are models that Philadelphia should seek to emulate in terms of transparency, such as Washington, D.C. Because if people understood what the OPA was doing, it would go a long way to create trust in the system. This concludes my testimony. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have at this time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, essentially, low-income communities, primarily of color, I know in my district in Southwest Philadelphia, looking at this particular map, and thank you for the map,
Sure.
are getting disproportionately higher assessments, according to your data.
Yes, disproportionately higher assessments, yes.
And just for the record, just from your perspective, and you probably touched on it briefly in your testimony, but just reiterate, what do you identify as some of the causes for the disparities that you mentioned, and how do you think also OPA can remedy these disparities by such models as, elaborate more on DC, because DC was just mentioned a few minutes ago prior to you coming here. So give us an overview of that aspect and also what you think are some of the causes for the disparities that you see throughout the city of Philadelphia.
Sure. So on the issue of the disparities, I think that really the Office of Property Assessment should be looking at the assessments on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis to make sure that they're accurate, that they're more uniform and less regressive, meaning that, you know, to make a fairer assessment by neighborhood. So not just be looking at it citywide, because so if they, for example, just really focused in on, okay, we're gonna fix the assessments in North Philadelphia, West Philadelphia, and Southwest Philadelphia, and we're gonna take, you know, these steps over the next 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and a year to get the measures, the COD and PRD down to acceptable ranges, you know, by 1 year. Let's just say, that, you know, then there'd be some benchmarks to say, okay, the people in those areas can expect fairer assessments in some time frame. I think that needs to happen. And the second thing in terms of Washington, D.C., I was mentioning Washington, D.C. in light of transparency, because if you go onto Washington, D.C.'s website, not only do they release their measures, the COD and PRD by geographic area, but they also detail out exactly how they calculate the assessments down to how much a half bathroom is worth, for example. I mean, you can use Washington, D.C.'s website to build your own assessment. And so that type of transparency goes a long way to have people trust the system. And so that's what I would say, you know, that should be a model to go for. And it's not, that's not something that we need to wait for CAMA to be implemented to do.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Councilman Maria Keone Sanchez, then Councilman Al Tottenberg. I'd like to also acknowledge the presence of Councilwoman Janie Blackwell.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your testimony and your review of the assessment process. Earlier, we were discussing a little bit around assessments, and we spent a little bit of time talking to OPA about GMAs. You say you conducted your analysis based on 14 geographic zones. How are they different from the 640 GMAs that OPA says it uses to create these general market area assessments?
I I actually don't know the answer to that because we used ours from, do you know? Oh, okay. Those, the GMAs are just smaller subdivisions of the zones that we use. These zones are straight from OPA, and then I would think that each zone then is broken further into GMAs.
You talked a little bit, and I know you were mentioning about DC and the ability, we spent a little bit of time talking about the difference between 1.5 baths for a long-term resident and the 3.5 baths of today. But you also talked about land assessments and the variation. One of the things that I found interesting in your testimony is that you said abated properties, the land value was, they were charging them more. Do you think they were trying to fill in a gap because it wasn't standardized? You know, so the land of a long-term resident versus an abated property, the price was different.
Yeah. I think it's because, and it's hard to know exactly because the OP isn't very transparent about how they calculate, but I think because it looks like they are taking a fixed percentage of 15 or 30% of the total property, of the total value of the property, and just assigning it to land, that if you have an abated property that has a higher overall value, then the land value gets inflated. If that makes sense?
Yep. No, I get that.
Okay.
In the Washington model, because I've not had a chance to look at it, is there a fixed land value? I mean, one of the things historically, and we've debated this here in council, and there was hearings going back to Councilman Marion Taskell years ago about the low value of land that we have, and then how improvements trigger reassessment, right? And so part of the narrative that we have in the city of Philadelphia is infrastructure investments get you a higher assessment. Improvements in your property get you a higher assessment. Right. New construction in your area gets you a new assessment. Like, how do we roll that back? You know, and to your point, part of the debate we'll be having over the next year is like, what is the methodology? And then how do we set policy in a methodology that we give value to long-term residents who haven't made improvements without penalizing them for the person with the pilot house on steroids.
Right. Yeah, and that's about taxpayer and homeowner protections.
I think the protections, and I think this council's been really proactive.
Yeah.
I believe, and unless you tell me otherwise from what you've seen across the country, that when our formula should take that into consideration. And I use this example. I have 100 houses on the block, 50 have not been touched, 20 have some minor improvements, and 30 may be new builds.
Okay.
You know, when you're averaging all things being equal, you can't. Right? And so this long-time fixed income person who is fine with their 1.5 bathrooms should not change because somebody has a pilot house on steroids and somebody made improvements, right? That may or may not be abated. Sort of like, how do you back end that into the formula so people aren't penalized for just being on fixed income and living?
I think that's because assessments are set at 100% of market value. That's hard to build in, but I think you could build it in terms of a protection for long-term homeowners.
Or improvements. Again,
yeah.
If we determine by policy we're giving an improvement of value, just like we give abatement, what I call an unrealized value, right? Because until you're paying taxes on your abatement, it's unrealized. But you're factoring that sales component into the GMA. And so my thing is, how do you back end that out for people, right? Long-term residents, and again, we've lost this narrative. They want to know that because they're fixed income in a house that they're comfortable with, as humble as it is, are not going to get fairly overassessed because of market forces with blunt instruments like tax abatements and all that.
But what about, I hear you, and I agree that there needs to be something to be done to do some type of protection on the long-time homeowner. Perhaps that's more than is now. I mean, it doesn't have to be done on the assessment. It could be done on the tax rate as well. because it would get to the.
I know that, but part of it is, that's what we've done. Council has tweaked homestead, UPA, loop, senior, I mean, like to me, that's an acknowledgement that what we're doing here is not fair, and we're trying to even out the balance. And my thing is, if we're going to fight this formula, transparency, and we're going to get a formula, we should be able to tell people, this is the value for you living humbly within this changing neighborhood. Otherwise, we're using all the blunt instruments to penalize them for being average and not wanting a house on steroids. I'm sorry.
No, I hear you.
So I'm just saying, is there, and if you can't answer this today, I like, as part of this public debate as we debate it, for someone to tell me why we can't factor that in. If we're, again, I think it's a policy, it's a political will, and what we value. Like, you know, and I have this debate constantly here in council, because we don't value people's sweat equity, we don't value, like, none of that ever has value. But anybody wants to build something on steroids, it's an investment. Let's give it all of this, you know.
So, Councilwoman, are you saying that if you, what you're looking for is, if you live, if let's say you're a longtime homeowner, that your assessment shouldn't rise by more than X% a year or something like that?
Well, I'm just saying that we should, in our formula, that should be taken into consideration. I don't know. I'm not an assessor. But what I'm saying is, I should, because I live humbly, right? And I have this in neighborhoods that I represent, South Kensington, you know, Norris Square. I have a senior who bought a house at $12,000, hasn't made improvements, and it's still standing because it's built by brick and real wood as opposed to panel and all this other stuff we do now. And it doesn't have all those amenities, right? Why does her value have to move exponentially, right? Because market forces, because of abatement blunt instruments, dictate it, right? And I'm saying is, if we value that person and we saying to them, we want you to stay there, it should be reflected in the formula.
I hear what you're saying.
I don't know how that happens. I mean, that's what the professionals are for.
It would require more of a conversation, I think, around the best.
To me, it's a political will and a policy one. It's if we're going to change the narrative the residents have that improvements drive them out of neighborhoods and improvements mean gentrification, we got to come up with the counter argument to that, right? And there has to be a value to it. I don't know what that is. Question, do you see anything around zoning, because we went through the zoning change, right? Did you look at or see anything around zoning that impacts the differential that we see in assessments?
We didn't particularly look at zoning and zoning's impact on assessments, so not at this time. I know there's a good amount of discussion around that issue, though.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your testimony, Controller.
Thank you.
At this time, I would like to bring up Mr.
Hold on.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's great, Mr. Chairman, not a problem.
Councilman Al Tottenberg.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very, very much.
You're welcome, sir.
Ms. Reinhardt, thank you for your testimony, and thank you for having your notes of testimony. I do have a question.
Sure.
Comment, and then, well, or maybe whatever. You had stated, I want to encourage the administration to commit to more than bare bones transparency. There are models that Philadelphia should seek to emulate in terms of transparency, namely Washington, D.C. You did give some details on that, which I liked, and I'm going to review your testimony,
great.
but I think it's very good. But let me ask you this, if you know the answer. Their model for transparency, is that because their administration so decided to do that, or is that by city ordinance of Washington, D.C.?
That's interesting. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
I like where you're
I'm
going.
going to find out.
Yeah, I like
I'll
where
get
you're
back
going.
To you. Okay. I do thank you. Mr. Chairman, that is all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
At this time, I would like to bring up expert Mr. Walter Spencer and former City Controller, Mr. Alan Buckowitz. Walter, please say your name for the record, and thank you for all your contributions, your volunteerism, and your advocacy to make sure that we work here in the City Council to get tax policy right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Councilman.
You're welcome.
Good afternoon. My name is Walter Spencer. I've lived in Philadelphia since 1997. I'm going to open by trying to address Councilman Sanchez's question, or Councilwoman Sanchez's question, which she's asked repeatedly about the gentrifying neighborhoods and the abated parcels. There are ways to capture that statistically so that you adjust for the greater value that an abated property has because it has an abatement. And so that, let's say that you run the statistics and it determines an analysis in that neighborhood, an abatement adds $75,000 to the sale price. That $75,000 would only apply to the parcels being abated. It wouldn't be applied to the parcels that have had some modifications, and it wouldn't apply to the parcels that have had no modifications. And that's something we used in a number of jurisdictions around the country with good success. I wanted to talk in my testimony today about two things, transparency and regressivity. There's been a lot of discussion about both of them and just hearing, and so I'm not going to read all this testimony, but I want to make a couple of points. I never worked on an appraisal job where I couldn't determine the value of property using a hand calculator. And what you needed to know was how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. Stuff you learn in elementary school. And so whether we have a CAMA system or we don't have a CAMA system, the goal for OPA should be to comply with the statute by May 1st and have documentation on their website that allows me to take my hand calculator and read the charts and tables on the website and recreate the value of my property. Now, I worked on books like that when we didn't have the internet in a number of communities around the country. I'm willing to volunteer to help OPA do that, and I think if we work together, it can be done by December 1st and be pretty close to what Washington has. And obviously, OPA would retain final control of the output or the content that went up on the web, but that's my offer to help the process along. Because I think once people understood where their assessments were coming from in granular detail, some people might not be happy with the taxes that they're being paid, but that they would understand that there's a method to the assessments and that their values might be reasonable and that that's probably what they could sell their house for. And I had those decisions with thousands of taxpayers across the country during my career in this industry. The second thing I would say is that both the audit that the council did and the audit that the controller did pointed to this problem with regressivity. And as the controller indicated, it's primarily in the 2nd, 3rd, 5th, and 7th wards. And there are some, whenever you use statistical models to value property, things tend to converge toward the center. So if the average price is $150,000, the properties that are around $150,000, the models do a great job. The properties that are much lower or much higher, the models tend to overvalue the lower valued properties and undervalue the higher valued properties. Now, there's some things you can do in your models when you build your models to counteract that. But until we see the models, we don't know whether OPA is doing that or not. And until we see the models, we can't be helpful to OPA in dealing with the regressivity problem. Finally, I want to remind people of the recommendations that the council president made on the day that the OPA audit was released. Council's audit of OPA was released, because I think they're all really necessary steps to be taken to resolve the issues that we've been dealing with now. I mean, I've been working on this issue with the technical staff here in council for 6 years. And over the last 24 months, frankly, I've seen regression. I personally don't feel our assessments are as good now as they were in 2013. So I think that the city should recruit new leadership for OPA, a new chief assessing officer, and 3 deputies, 1 for residential, 1 for commercial, and 1 for modeling. And I think these are people that should have each worked in at least 2 jurisdictions outside Philadelphia before they get here, because broad experience helps. You get to work in different places, see how different people attack and address problems, and you bring that knowledge and background to Philadelphia with you. Secondly, I think that the city ought to hire a consulting firm to help them write an RFP to bring in another firm to help clean up these assessments. I don't think the city staff is going to be able to do it on their own. And I could see 5 or 10 years from now where we would be sitting here having a very similar sort of discussion. And then I think thirdly, that consulting firm that's brought on to help hire an outside contractor should write an RFP, bring in an outside contractor to help get the values corrected, and to provide a lot of additional training to the OPA staff so that once the contractor is finished, OPA has a much better chance of maintaining the work that the contractor has done. I would remind you that 2 years ago, OPA contracted with a firm called A.R. Hughes for help on the valuation of commercial property. And that effort produced $112 million in revenue for the city and the school district. I don't think that necessarily bringing on another consultant is going to produce large amounts of revenue, but I think it will produce some, because I think there's probably inventory that has been missed. It's just not on the city's books at all, and so consequently those people aren't getting taxes. And so that's my recommendation as an individual on a path forward for our city. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Alan Butkovitz. I am the former city controller. And to begin with, I would like to take a moment to pay tribute to Dave Glancy, the longtime chairman of the Board of Revision of Taxes, who passed away yesterday, and who really, his mission in life was to try to create a fairer, more accurate tax system in Philadelphia. And he was just a all-round great human being. And I'm sure we will all miss him. I think Councilman Sanchez asked a great question, and I think if you remember back to your girlhood and The Wizard of Oz, it might lead you to an answer.
which is you'll remember that the punchline of that story was that she always had the power to go home and to solve her problem. And several of the problems that we have in dealing with this issue is this complexity and super complexity, so that no layman can possibly understand what people talk about transparency, but nobody knows what they're talking about. And you have to have a PhD really to figure out these coefficients of dispersion and all of that. And this idea that we are locked in a uniformity straitjacket. Now, progressivism in the United States and progressivism in the states for the last 100 years held that fair taxes meant taxes that are progressive, the taxes that do not impact the poor people disproportionately to everybody else. So I'd say, in the first place, it's insane for Philadelphia, which proclaims itself to be a progressive city, to build a tax system on the backs of poor people and to basically make the real estate tax the tax for city services, to move away from the wage tax and from other income. In the state of Pennsylvania, in the United States of America, the idea has always been that you want people who have income. People who have income can pay taxes. People who live in a house and inherit it and are 80 or 85 years old, and on paper the house is worth a lot of money, it doesn't mean anything to them if they're making $16,000 a year and they can barely pay the tax. So first of all, the city council, now what's happened is Harrisburg has moved in on this and kind of restrained the freedom of the city to deal with that. But that should be the focus of the city, because there are many things about Philadelphia's real estate taxes and about the demographics of Philadelphia that are unique to Philadelphia. When we were working on the 2013 audit in the Comptroller's office about real estate assessments, we were shocked to learn that 40% of Philadelphia homeowners are below the poverty line. Now, the national experts in this field believe that if you own a house, you must be a person of means. But there's a tremendous number of properties that change hands for $1. And not only does that mean that those people can't afford escalating taxes, it also makes it extremely difficult to get an accurate sample to determine what the real values are within that region. So this debate starts with the assumption that we have to bow down to the uniformity clause. But nobody notes, and I really would like to hammer this home this time, that the state constitution was amended in 1984 to give Philadelphia specifically an out for the uniformity clause. And that constitutional provision said that uniformity is not the end-all and be-all, because it said if you're living in a gentrifying neighborhood, which it defined as anywhere where the property values are being raised because there's nearby construction, then the City Council of Philadelphia has the power to grant a uniform system of relief based on that. So as one example, you had a citywide reassessment in 2014. That was supposedly accurate. I remember the Nutter administration saying at the time, give us 5 or 6 years and we'll get the wrinkles out. And now it's 5 or 6 years later, and Mr. Spencer says it's worse than it was in 2013, right? So one thing that you could accomplish, and that I've been advocating, is to impose an inflation cap or a double inflation cap on people in any area which has been impacted by nearby construction. And frankly, remember when the Comcast headquarters went up and they were classified as a distressed area at 17th and JFK Boulevard because the entire city of Philadelphia was determined to be a distressed area? In my opinion, you could apply that relief citywide. There's construction going on in every neighborhood, and it doesn't say within every council district or within every or ward. It says nearby construction. So I think you could right off the bat. Now there's a problem because the state legislature passed enabling legislation in 1988 that would have given this council flat out the power to do that, and then somehow, before the loop legislation came in, the Nutter administration went to Harrisburg and actually made that law tougher, not easier. They changed the state law so that you could only qualify for that kind of relief if you were very poor. I think they used a $15,000 limit. And it was passed by the legislature unanimously in both houses, which to me means that the mayor of Philadelphia asked for it. They wouldn't do something like that without the okay of Philadelphia. So the first step is to go back to Harrisburg and say, let's amend the enabling legislation to go back to the way it was before Loop was enacted, so that then council has the fullest power to grant whatever relief they want. I think there is a secret agenda here. The secret agenda is backdoor tax increases, right? Which was part of the problem of the BRT. The idea was that without council taking a vote, they would raise taxes anytime the mayor needed money, and they didn't want to have that. But now, several things happened. When AVI was enacted, the tax borrowing capacity of the city was multiplied by 10. So instead of the city being able to borrow $1 billion, the city now has the power to borrow $10 billion and bankrupt itself to its heart's delight. But that was a gimmick that put cash in the hands of the mayor and the administration. So they like that. The other thing that they like is that every year they can go back and they can do a 30% increase or a 50% increase, and it's a cash cow. It doesn't, when Dave Glancy was trying to sell AVI, the idea was going to be what Councilman Dom said, that if the values went up one year, then you were going to lower the rate that year so that you got the same amount of money. And, right? And instead, so look what happened this year. The 5-year plan that Mayor Kenny had last year anticipated that there would be an increase in real estate revenue of 5%. So it actually came in at 11%. It came in twice what they had planned on spending. And what happened after that? He said he wanted a 5% increase in the rate. So what was anticipated under long-term financial planning to be a 5% increase in revenues was proposed to be a 15% increase in revenues and finally settled in at an 11% increase. As you well know, Philadelphia is the largest city in the country that is in poverty. It has a 28% poverty rate. The reason that we don't collect a lot of real estate taxes because you cannot get blood out of a stone. There are people who cannot afford that. When the Inquirer did their series back, I think it was in 2013 or it might have been the year before, the average real estate tax in Philadelphia was something like $1,200 or $1,400. And there were responses from people at the elite like, well, what's the big deal? Montgomery County, its average is $7,000. But the truth of the matter is that the average person in Philadelphia could not afford $1,200 a year. And when the tax goes from $1,200 to $1,700, it is a crisis for many people. So why keep beating around the bush and saying that we're going to tweak it here and we got an adjustment and I got a complicated formula here when you have within your grasp the power to say that the state constitution recognizes hardship, the hardship of gentrification, as legitimate a tax theory as uniformity, right? The rest of the progressives in the state would die to have that. We got it in the Constitution. We got it in the Constitution because at one time, Philadelphia's legislative leaders ran the legislature and they were able to get whatever they want. And ever since we lost that position, Philadelphia's been taking it on the chin. But I have a hard time recurrently seeing this turn into some kind of academic seminar where the average person can't understand what's being done to them or why, and a bunch of technicians who have proven now that they can't get it right. And it is altogether possible, and I think probable, that they will never get it right. And they will never get it right because there's not enough data points in Philadelphia. Because you can't really draw the boundaries between neighborhoods. And, Councilwoman Blackwell knows that she lives in a district where you could be living in a $500,000 mansion on one side of the street, and you could be in an impoverished area on the other side of the street. And how our assessors, especially from outside Philadelphia, that's something that you know because you live in the neighborhood, and it's something that you used to have expertise on from the Board of Revision of Taxes because they were local people. And if you come in from Chicago or someplace else, you never get that right. And you got people who are coming to you with $5,000 tax bills who do not have the resources and the income of the people that they thought they were assessing. the structure may look the same. You know what they say, real estate, location, location, location. You want to find a technical answer? You got places down 8th and Christian and so on where there's people living on the block and their houses are worth $3,000. And at the other end of the block, you got like, I think there was 3 airline pilots who paid $180,000 to buy a shell of a house and to rip it out and to turn it into a mansion. So you tell me, what are the houses in the middle of that block worth? Right? Gentrification is an enormous issue in this city. There are very large, and frankly, I've seen some polling lately that shows in terms of numbers, it's the biggest issue in the city. There's something like 65% of the people in this city, surprisingly, both races and across income categories, who believe that people of color and minorities are being forcefully pushed out of their neighborhoods by development, by gentrification. And one of the biggest tools to do that is the real estate tax. The way the assessment process works and the way the real estate tax is being applied, that's the bulldozer that's moving those people out of Philadelphia. So I think all the council people present now have, I think, sincerely expressed concern about that population, but you're kind of being hammered and driven into thinking that you got to come up with some super sophisticated mathematical formula. And I urge you to seize the political power that you have. Get Harrisburg to change that, and I also volunteer to help you. Change the law back, and then adopt a series of uniform relief measures under the rubric of hardship. Because you all know that you can make a lot easier argument for hardship of your constituents than you can for uniformity. And then the city is just going to have to learn to live within it means mayors are not going to get unrestricted pots of money that they can use as down payments for new cars, right? Okay.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Councilwoman Reguera Sanchez.
Thank you so very much for both of your testimonies. Walter, thank you for your always willingness to work with us here in council. We really do appreciate it. Mr. Bukovitz, real quickly, so the move to property taxes has been, I think we've had 4 commissions about tax what is immobile versus what's mobile. So are you saying you do not agree with that philosophy that has been debated by all the different tax commissions?
Excuse me just one second. I just want to acknowledge for the record, Councilman Brian O'Neill is present.
Okay, sorry.
Please continue.
That's the same race to the bottom kind of philosophy, that we would have to actually get rid of the minimum wage. We'd have to give property away from companies to have them come here, because they could always go to South Carolina and pay lower wages, and they could go from South Carolina to Mexico and pay lower wages, and then they could go to Taiwan, and then they could go to Malaysia, etc. We have rejected that, and in fact, this council's on record as saying that we need to create the momentum in the other direction, that we need to set $15 as a livable minimum wage. Mm-hmm. So why would we take a different position there? People, for the most part, look, the abatements succeeded. They accomplished what they were supposed to. They stimulated construction in the city when the city was dead and nobody would construct. Now people are coming here not because of the abatements, but because it's a hot neighborhood, mm-hmm. right? They're coming in because the momentum is there. In fact, the whole world has changed in the last 20 years. Kids want to live in cities. They don't want to go to the suburbs. They love the excitement of the city. Therefore, businesses are locating in the city because they want to serve their customers and they want to serve the traffic that's in the city. New York lives by that philosophy. We don't want to have the high taxes that New York has, but by the same token, all of the Reaganomic symbolic tax cuts haven't accomplished anything. First of all, it doesn't amount to any money, right? The business community, frankly, would much rather have predictability of what's going to happen and regulations and know that there's going to be sympathy for their problems than to worry about a 0.0006 change in the wage tax or the business tax year to year. You don't hear the complaints that you heard about that in 1999 and 2000, right? They don't want it. They were looking for an excuse to get out of Philadelphia before. Now I've never seen anything like this in my life. If you turn your back, the value of your property goes up. I mean, it sounds superficially like a good problem to have. except that you realize that now you have to have the income of the person that's moving in order to keep up with everybody.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Bukovitz.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Anyone else here to testify for this hearing? Ms. Malin Shakuma, Teresa McCory, please state your name for the record and begin your testimony.
Good afternoon. My name is Teresa McCormick. I'm in Council District Number 2 under Councilman Kenyatta Johnson, and I'm here to testify on a resolution 180355. Okay, as I stated earlier, the concerns we have, my question is, what happened to the loop program from your district, Councilman? Because quite a few of us lost it. And the other thing that's a concern for us with the new resolution, there should be a formula across the board. As I stated earlier, I live on Wharton Street, and the average, it was assessed for our block 121,200. But then if we go into the block right behind us, which is 2100 of Reed Street, we're finding that the assessment value for a two-story home there was $42,500. When you compare the land for that particular block is $1,099, but for us on Wharton Street was only 960 square footage. It's not adding up. If you go on the next block over, which is Federal Street, those are three-story homes, and their square footage is average as ours, but the improvement value jumped up to 2,250. But their assessment value was $73,500. That is not adding up. They have not. I've listened since I've been here, and they're not giving me an assessment on telling us how are you coming up with these numbers. They're not adding up at all. My real serious concern on my particular block, which is fast and growing, last year we had the highest was sold at $155, and we had an increase of $400. Now this year we had 3 houses that were sold at $333,000. Those homes will receive the 10-year tax abatement. But when we go down to the assessment for the appeal, they're going to go off of $335,000 for us, that's long-time residents, versus those that's getting a 10-year tax abatement. So again, as I stated to the board here, that there's a serious problem here. They're not giving us true examples or reasonings or formulas of what's going on and how can we fix it. That's why I'm stating to council that to eliminate what they have going on, because if you look at what's going to, if we're complaining now about the 400 increase, which is 11%, can you imagine if next year with the new homes that were sold this year, well, just in 2018, which is going to show up for 2020, that's going to be way past that 400 that we're complaining about now. That's the part that they're not explaining to the council here at all. So that's my concern.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Madam Shakumba.
Madam Shakumba, North Washington Avenue Coalition. I support the resolutions that you're trying to pass with reservations. Reason being is that we're still under this 10-year abatement mess. And you gave me this, I found this 10-year abatement study. The abatement study in itself fosters gentrification. It pushes for gentrification. Why? Because it says, we'll give you, to rehab our areas that are not up to par, money to produce and change things. The study was done by the same company that did the original study in 2014. Did you expect that this man would ever make anything other than a positive report to you? I mean, give me a break. You should have at least gotten somebody else to do the report, but you didn't. And the problem is Jones, Lang, and LaSalle in 2014, and then you turned around and got them in 2018. No. And what did you do? You forced this gentrification by letting the banks give them all the money they needed to rehab the dilapidated areas, and then turned around. Did you put any pressure on the bank, step on the backs of the banks and tell them to provide money to low income and moderate income people so that they could rehab the existing houses that they're in? No, instead they redlined us. Another method of gentrification between the redlining and this here so-called property of tax abatement. And then had the nerve in the report say it would take the school district 4 more years if they were to do anything about the tax abatement to reach the what they call the crossover point. In other words, our kids are supposed to suffer 4 more years under this abatement. You have already killed off I don't know how many generations of kids with poor education because you have not funded the school district. You took that money and gave it away to people who don't need it. I'm tired of it. When are you going to stop giving away our money and start supporting our schools? We need money in our schools. We can't wait another 4 years for this abatement program. It needs to drop. It needs to be gotten rid of. Yes, we do need this here change with OPA. We definitely need that. There's no doubt about that. I already showed you what I have to show you in terms of what OPA has done. I have my statistics here. I would give it to you today, but I noticed I made a mistake on it. Okay? But they fouled up, they've been fouling up, and they continue to foul up. Okay? What is the resolution? You have the resolution here. Yeah. I lost my copy.
This one.
Yeah, the resolution. Okay, whereas, and now it says the city tax assessment for 2019 found that the office saw the tax assessment increased by 7.5%. This was more than that. Okay, the impact of the major assessment after several years of fairly consistent, I like this one, several years of fairly consistent assessment in the tax year between 2015 and 2018. Fairly, you know what you're talking about? The only thing they did was to change what went into what pot. They changed the land, increased the land value, and decreased the property value. So they didn't want to hit you twice with something. They wanted to make the blow easier on you, so you didn't see no difference. And the only people who saw any difference were those who had abatements. They now had to pay more money for the land than they had to do before. So that's why it was consistent. Now in 2019, you want to jump on everybody's back because Mayor Kenny wants to increase our taxes. And so what can he do? Increase the taxes on assessments. We need to freeze the tax assessments. I made a mistake in the last saying freeze taxes. I didn't mean to freeze the real estate taxes. Freeze tax assessments to the 2018 level. That's what has to be done. Until we get this mess straightened out, freeze those tax assessments at 2018 level. Do not proceed, okay? Then you won't need a loop program, because if you proceed with a loop program, I don't know what Mr. Dubois said about the doggone loop program puts it this time. Oh, yeah, I mean, when we were running for it, he said they had no money and wanted to reduce the average median income from 150% down to 80%, and with your support, talking about they had no money. We had to fight to restore it to 150%. Now, how in the hell are you going to come up with another loop? Where's that money coming from if you didn't have enough for the first one? I don't know where it's coming from, but you ready to push for it. I'm trying to figure out where's the money going to come from. Or it may be the, the finance department may come up with a magical cure. I always said, my mom said, figures don't lie, but liars sure do figure. And they doing some lying. Somebody's doing something. That's all I got to say.
Thank you very much. This concludes this public hearing. To the call of the chair. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for your participation.